Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're taking the incredibly abstract, highly mathematical world of economic theory, and we are translating it into the literal, physical biology of the human brain. We're going to pop the hood and look at the physical engine that drives literally every single choice you make. So let's kick things off with kind of a weird question. If Adam Smith, the founding father of classical economics, were alive today, would he use an MRI machine? For centuries, economists were incredibly frustrated because they had to treat the human mind like this impenetrable black box. Sure, you could see what people ultimately chose, but you could never actually see the internal calculations that led them to that choice. And you can see just how badly early economists wanted to peek inside that box. Back in 1881, Francis Ysidro Edgeworth literally dreamed up what he called a hedon meter. He imagined this ideally perfect instrument that could mathematically measure the exact height of pleasure and utility someone experienced from moment to moment. For the late 19th century, that sounds like pure science fiction, right? Well, today, we actually possess that sci-fi machine, and it's given rise to an entirely new discipline called neuroeconomics. So instead of just assuming people act logically, neuroeconomists are looking right at the biological hardware, the brain regions, the individual neurons, the neurotransmitters, to see exactly how we calculate value. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll meet neuroeconomics and step inside the brain's engine. After that, we'll look at reading minds with fMRI, explore the anatomy of risk, and finally, wrap up with how we can actually hack our own decisions. All right, parts 1 and 2 meet neuroeconomics and inside the brain's engine. Let's get right into it. To really grasp how we choose, we have to zoom way, way down into the micromachinery inside our heads. Take a look at the physical structure of a single neuron. You've got about 100 billion of these little guys. You've got these branch-like extensions called dendrites acting as receivers, taking in signals. And then there's that single long cable called the axon, which is the output wire broadcasting the final computation to the next set of cells. And that computation, it's physically processed as an electrical impulse called an action potential. It's basically a biological adding machine. The neuron sits there at a resting equilibrium, but when enough chemical signals hit it, sodium rushes into the cell and crosses a very specific voltage threshold. Boom! Once that line is crossed, it fires that action potential, a literal wave of electrical energy straight down the axon. When that electrical spike hits the very end of the line, it reaches a microscopic gap called a synapse. Here, it releases chemical neurotransmitters across that gap to trigger the dendrites of the next neuron in line. This step-by-step incremental computation, that is the literal physical basis of every single financial, social, and personal decision you have ever made. The whole shebang. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This physical engine runs on actual metabolic fuel, and it is incredibly expensive to keep running. Even though your brain makes up only about 3% of your total body mass, it is a total gas guzzler. It greedily consumes over 20% of your body's oxygen and sugar. Which brings us to part 3, reading minds with fMRI. Because this neural activity is so metabolically expensive, it creates a massive opportunity for scientists. It gives us a perfectly observable way to measure decision-making from the outside. Classical economics always had to rely on revealed preferences, basically looking at past behaviors to guess what people valued. But neuroeconomics, it uses brain imaging to literally watch those valuations happen in real time, long before a choice is even finalized. The main tool we use to watch this happen is functional MRI, or fMRI. It tracks what's called the BOLD signal. That stands for blood oxygen level dependence. Remember that huge metabolic cost we just talked about? Well, when a brain region works hard to calculate a decision, it needs more fuel. The fMRI physically tracks the rush of oxygenated blood heading straight to those specific active brain regions. It literally follows the fuel. Moving on to part 4, the anatomy of risk. Let's zoom back out and apply this biological window to how we calculate risk and handle choices under uncertainty. What's absolutely fascinating is that different pieces of our decision-making puzzle live in completely separate areas of the brain. When you evaluate a gamble, your striatum lights up to calculate the expected reward. But completely independently, your insular cortex fires up to process the variance, the risk. Your brain literally splits the math problem into different physical locations. But as you might guess, our biological calculators aren't perfectly logical. They are heavily prone to framing effects. Take this incredible medical data, for example. When doctors looked at cancer treatments framed as mortality rates, like 10% mortality for surgery versus 0% for radiation, they preferred the radiation. But when the exact same data was framed as survival rates, 90% survival for surgery versus 100% for radiation, their choices completely reversed to favor surgery. It's the exact same math, but a totally different biological evaluation. I mean, if highly trained oncologists can get tricked by framing, just imagine how vulnerable our everyday choices are. This little quirk is deeply tied to loss aversion, our irrational, outsized fear of losing compared to gaining the same amount. Neuroimaging shows us that this fear of loss is processed heavily by the amygdala, which is basically the brain's ancient fear center. So losing a little bit of money literally triggers the exact same biological hardware as facing a physical threat in the wild. Crazy, right? And finally, part 5, hacking our decisions. This brings us to a really fascinating frontier. Because if our choices are ultimately just biological computations driven by metabolic shifts and chemical balances, it means we can actually step in and alter the hardware directly. Scientists have proven this causally in the lab. If you physically stress someone out by plunging their hands into freezing cold water, that physical stress actually makes them more risk-averse. On the flip side, if you disrupt the right prefrontal cortex with magnets or artificially lower their serotonin levels, people actually start to crave risk. We're literally rewiring their economic preferences. But you don't always need magnets or freezing water. We can hack our biology just through cognitive framing. In one study, researchers told subjects to simply think like a trader when evaluating financial gambles. That simple perspective shift measurably and actively downregulated the fear responses in their amygdala when they faced a potential loss. It's quite literally mind over biological matter. Which leads us to a pretty profound final thought for today. Ironically, neuroeconomists have found that patients with actual brain damage to their emotional centers often make much more strictly rational economic choices, simply because they don't feel loss aversion or get swayed by framing effects. So it leaves us to wonder, if damaging the brain makes us perfectly rational economists, is our so-called irrationality actually a highly evolved, completely necessary feature for human survival?